Right, well, with us to review the morning's newspapers are Lucy Beresford and Matthew Staddon. As you can see, Lucy, Matthew, thank you very much for coming in. Happy Sunday morning to you both. It's hot out there. We're going to get to that later. But let's start with the front of the Telegraph. And all the papers have this reporting, of course, after the moment yesterday when Daniel Khalif was pulled off that bicycle, Matthew. And what are the Telegraph saying about what happened?
Yeah, this is an extraordinary story, isn't it? And it was a 3 or 4 day hunt in one of the world's great capital cities for a terror suspect. Hugely embarrassing to all concerned, hugely embarrassing to the Prime Minister, who we can also see smiling here on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph with his wife. He was very relieved, I think it's fair to say, when Daniel Khalif was captured, because he would have been desperate for this not to become a metaphor for Tory rule. But he was captured in West London, not too far from where I live, on the Grand Union Canal, just around about 11:45, I think. I was off to another news studio and saw police cars rushing around and a helicopter. I think a lot of people who lived in West London have seen something of this chase.
Did you hear the choppers overhead?
The choppers overhead.
Friday night, yeah.
Yes,
because they did actually, they were zoning in on that really small part of London. And then they'd been doing that almost from the beginning, once they'd had some sightings of him at Wandsworth Roundabout. So the intelligence must have been really good once the counter-terrorism people got involved. But there was this delay.
Yeah.
There was this extraordinary delay from the prison letting them.
That it was in Richmond Park as well. The idea that someone in 2023 might have been hiding away in Richmond Park amongst the deer. It raises so many questions, though, doesn't it? Because if you do anything wrong on the roads, rightly, you get a letter in the post very quickly, don't you? If you park in the wrong place, or if you go down the wrong road. And yet here was a chap who was able to evade the full might of the British state for over 3 days.
And some of the sort of quotes around it are quite interesting. I think a police officer said he's a very resourceful young man. I mean, he was on the run for 3 days. I guess that is...
To hide in plain sight is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But also found with a Waitrose carrier bag. So did someone give that to him? Did he go into a store?
Where did he get these bits from? I mean, we're not sure what kind of bike it was. I kind of imagine him on one of those higher bikes, but obviously you'd have to have payments to get that.
Well, yes, most people do that on their mobile phones, and apparently he wasn't using his mobile phone at all. And also, it is interesting that the headline references the fact that he was laughing after his arrest. Well, from a psychological point of view, lots of people laugh when they're incredibly nervous or they realise that they've been found out. I mean, that's what children do. So I thought the headline was a bit misleading.
I mean, don't forget, we don't know why he was laughing. Don't forget, he did serve in the British military. I mean, he was a soldier, so he would have been taught a certain amount of resourcefulness. But there are serious questions to be asked, of course, not least about how our prisons are being run, how understaffed they are, the lack of resourcing. And one of the things, I mean, this fits in, you could argue, if you're trying to make politics out of this, into the schools story, the crumbling schools story, because some people will say, well, this is partly down to that policy of austerity that Cameron and Osborne brought in at the beginning of this sort of period of Tory rule, and are the chickens now coming home to roost?
But the other thing I would say to that is that actually there were far more people absconding from prisons prior to the Tories taking over 13 years ago. There's actually been very few. One of the reasons why this has dominated the bulletins for so long is because it is actually a really novel story to have somebody break out from a prison. But as you say, Rishi Sunak would have been really keen for it to have been resolved.
He pumped out his message from India very quickly, saying how delighted he was.
And as you rightly point out, I think it is very instructive of the sort of the point that people will have felt Britain has got to with crumbling schools and with prisoners escaping. Let's move on to another story that's on the front page of the Telegraph as well. This one you've picked out, Lucy, and it concerns Rishi Sunak.
Yes, so the G20 is taking place in New Delhi, and there are several stories that have been coming out. But the one that the Telegraph are zoning in on is the fact that Rishi Sunak has, from his very early days, had a very strong alliance with Giorgia Meloni, who's the head of the very right-wing.
You nearly said far right, but not quite.
There are some people who would argue that it is very far right, and she has been toning down some of her rhetoric since she took power. And to be fair, they came to power almost within days of each other, and there have been photos in the past of them, clearly getting on really well. They've identified some ways of tackling migration. Italy is right at the front line of a lot of the people who come in small boats. They have it's estimated actually 4 times the number of people landing on their shores as we have here in the UK. And what's interesting about this piece in the Telegraph is that there is also reference made to Austria, who has also come out at the G20 saying that they want Brussels to follow a similar sending back to Rwanda plan for migrants. So Rishi Sunak will be finding like-minded souls within 1 or 2 people at the G20 summit. And I also want to say that there are a couple of other stories, because obviously Rishi Sunak is hoping for a trade deal with India to be announced either at this particular event or maybe just in the days after, and also the soft power of his incredibly stylish wife. There have been some fantastic, fashion is a very important industry. It's not a very superficial thing, but I do think she has looked incredible and has clearly been taken to the hearts of India. They have been much more interested in finding out about her and what she's going to be doing and who she's going to be wearing than they have been about Rishi.
Her father helps as well, being owning Infosys.
It's an important moment. We've got a British Indian Prime Minister for the first time visiting India as our representative, as our political representative. The optics are very strong and quite poignant and powerful, I think.
The warmth of the hug that Narendra Modi gave Rishi Sunak. He, very cordially shook hands with Joe Biden and, watched Sergei Lavrov trip over the carpet, which was fantastic. But then as soon as Rishi Sunak comes along and namastes him, and they had this incredible hug.
That said, he is, as you've pointed out, cozying up to Georgia Meloni, and there would be many who would call a spade and say that she is hard right, possibly even far right. But the suggestion here is that he thinks he's onto something with the Rwanda deals, whereas there doesn't seem to be any evidence so far that the Rwanda idea is working.
Well, not yet, and I think their argument would be, it's deterrence, right? It's the idea that if you come to Europe, you're going to be offshored somewhere that you don't want to go.
There are other countries who are looking at that as a model and who actually think that it's something they want to emulate.
Yeah, well, we'll see if it gets through the courts. I think the Rwanda deal's coming back through the courts in October. Let's move on. And Matthew, I don't know how you slept last night. It wasn't too bad. I had the fan and the window open, but we're going to have another hot day. But I think, as Joe was telling us earlier, this is the last one of the really hot days.
Yeah, we did actually I borrowed a fan from my parents yesterday evening, carted it back to my wife so that we could have a bit of relief. But I've been rather enjoying it, although London in the heat it's not a dry heat. It's quite a sweaty heat.
So humid.
But just incredible that the hottest day of the year was on the 9th of September. I think I measured it I looked at my phone. It was about 30 degrees at 20 to 7 in the evening, which is remarkable, isn't it? Anyway, 33.2 degrees centigrade. The tabloids love a good weather story, and here it is, sunbathers enjoying it. That's a sweltering 92 degrees Fahrenheit in old money. And this is how, we used to talk in Fahrenheit when I was growing up in the 80s. And I remember these Indian summers. I don't know how many of them were, but I remember going around with my fireman's hat and my little bicycle when I was about 4 or 5, and you'd be going back to school.
And it would be scorching.
It'd be wonderfully what you think, well, why couldn't it have happened last week?
Yeah, no, I do remember that as well.
Can we sit outside? That was the refrain that you always used to ask your teachers, please, can we have the lesson outside?
That first couple of weeks. Have your parents got air conditioning? You took their fan away. How are they coping?
They had another fan.
Good. You didn't deprive them.
Got 2. Good question. That's good journalistic skills.
It came from my editor. No, it came from me. All right. And let's look quickly at the last story that we picked out here on the front of the Times, Lucy. And this is a fascinating story. This is of Chinese spies in the Commons.
Yes, so a man was arrested in March, actually also with another man. This man is of Britain, but he did actually have some work in China, and the fear is that he might have been radicalised while he was there, or turned in a way, and to come back and work in Parliament to actually possibly spy for China.
Well, not just work, but work with the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat.
Well, yes, but actually
Tom
Tugendhat actually stopped working with this gentleman last year when he stood for the Conservative leadership election. So he actually hasn't been working alongside him since he's been Security Minister. So actually that doesn't quite, the timeline doesn't quite dovetail for that. But I think people are really worried about the vetting process within Parliament, that if a man who may have very strong links to the Chinese government has actually been allowed to have access to such power and people, as you say, who do have access to sensitive or even compromising material, what does that say about the vetting processes within Parliament?
Yeah, and Tugendhat was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, I think, at the time.
And has done some important work on China and the so-called rise of China.
And it seems there's two people who've been arrested. So the one person who worked in the Commons as a researcher and perhaps someone who is his handler. I mean, it seems like this aspiring may well have been uncovered here.
Well, I mean, that's speculation, isn't it? And we'll have to wait and see. But it is, as you say, concerning. And we're all kind of thinking about it a bit more, aren't we, with TikTok being a Chinese app and whether we should be using TikTok or
But
not.
also the head of the MI5 has basically identified China as being the entity that is probably doing most to try to infiltrate the British government at really high levels. And this does speak to the fact that they've been able to penetrate it very successfully. I don't know what led to the arrest in March or what intelligence they had to go for this person. But I think what is being talked about, it isn't just necessarily the material that they have access to, but what kind of messaging are they putting out there? How are they influencing MPs? Let's say an MP like Ian Duncan Smith, for example, who's notoriously hawkish on China. It's very possible that they might be influenced by conversations that they have with this man. So it's not necessarily that he's taking state secrets, but it's how is the messaging being massaged to the advantage of the
Just very quickly
Communist Party.
Tie this story with the story that we were just doing on Modi and Sunak and the G20. I mean, talking about the power and the rise of China, India is also obviously rising, and India has just invited the African Union into the G20. And they want to have big influence on the continent of Africa, just as China already has. So we're watching tectonic plates shift in geopolitics at the moment.
Huge power competition. Lucy, Matthew, thank you very much for this hour. See you again next hour.